In Genesis 22 then, Abraham has cast out Ishmael. Isaac is his only son, the one left in the family. And it came to pass in Genesis 22 verse 1, after these things, that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And I'm sure, brothers and sisters, we're all familiar, aren't we, with the idea of the tempting that's going on here. The word means to prove or to test. Just come with me to Exodus in chapter 15, because it's a word that forms a bit of a theme in some of the early chapters of the book of Exodus. And you remember we saw yesterday, didn't we, that the birth of Isaac and then the casting out of Ishmael stands as a picture of the redemption from bondage, the release which the children of Israel underwent from Egypt, and then a type of the Lord Jesus Christ and the release which he brought. And so now Abraham is going to be tested or proved. And in Exodus chapter 15, if you have a look at verse 25, Moses cried unto Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree, which when he had cast it into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them, and said, If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of Yahweh thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee. And so then the test was, if they could keep these four things, then God would be with them and bless them. If you move on into chapter 16 of Exodus and verse 4, we're told that Yahweh said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them, whether they will walk in my law or no. So God was, having brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, was testing them to see whether they would walk in his way, to see whether they would walk after his law, to see, brothers and sisters, whether they were the children of Abraham. But in chapter 17, there is a reversal of the role. Exodus 17 and verse 1, we're told that the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys, according to the commandment of Yahweh, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses, and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt Yahweh? And it's the same word as prove in Exodus 15 and 16. God, brothers and sisters, was putting the children of Israel to the test to see whether they would walk in his laws. And now they turn on him and say, Well, why can't you give us water then? And that's commemorated, isn't it, in verse 7 of Exodus 17. He called the name of the place Massa and Meribah because of the chiding of the children of Israel and because they tempted Yahweh, saying, Is Yahweh among us or not? And finally, brothers and sisters, it culminates in Exodus chapter 20. Because in Exodus chapter 20, Moses receives the commandments of God. And all the people in verse 18 saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. God, brothers and sisters, was testing them to see if they would walk after his way, to see if they would walk in his commandments. And this was the purpose, wasn't it, of what was going on in Genesis 22. God was bringing Abraham to see whether he would walk after his commandments. It is the same, brothers and sisters, for us as well in our lives. The events and the circumstances that occur in our lives, God tests us to see if we will walk after his commandments. Just come forward to Psalm 26, please. Because Psalm 26 gives us another point of view on this. Something we were thinking about on Sunday night. Psalm 26 and verse 1, Judge me, O Yahweh, for I have walked in mine integrity. I have trusted also in Yahweh, therefore I shall not slide. Examine me, O Yahweh, and prove me. Try my reins and my heart. And David is asking, isn't he, that God might test him, might try him, might see whether David will walk in his commands and after his ways. And what about us, brothers and sisters? Are we prepared to submit ourselves to this testing of God? Would we feel comfortable with this level of scrutiny? Just come forward now to the book of Ecclesiastes. Let's have a look at chapter 2. Because it's not just the circumstances of our lives, brothers and sisters. King Solomon was prepared to undergo this scrutiny and to put himself to the test. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 1. Solomon said in his heart, Go to now. I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, what we have is a picture of Solomon enjoying all the things which he brings before him and testing himself against them to see what his reaction is going to be. And all this is vanity, is his conclusion. And so in chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes and verse 23, Solomon says, All this have I proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Solomon, brothers and sisters, used the wisdom which he had been given by God to test these things. And that should be our attitude as well. We have been given the wisdom from God. We have been given the word that we might test those things in our lives, that we might scrutinize them to see where they measure up, to see where they fit, to see whether they come up to the standard which God has set for us or not. God tested Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. That's a phrase that recurs in Genesis chapter 22. At the end of verse 1 it comes. We have it in verse 7. When Isaac spake to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I. It's exactly the same Hebrew phrase, I think. And at the end of verse 11, the angel of Yahweh called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. Abraham, brothers and sisters, was prepared to answer the test. Abraham was prepared and willing to serve his God. We get the same idea and the same phrase come in Genesis 31 and Genesis 37, speaking about Jacob and Joseph and their eagerness to go to serve. And we get the same thing in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 4. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 4, the angel of Yahweh appeared unto Moses in verse 2. And Moses turns aside. And in verse 4, Yahweh sees that he turned aside to see. And God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. We get the same thing in Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 3, where Samuel initially thinks it's Eli calling him in the night. And Eli has to say, it's not me. Go and answer God instead. And finally, brothers and sisters, just have a look at Isaiah chapter 6. In Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah sees, doesn't he, a vision of the glory of God filling the world, filling the temple. And in verse 8, he hears the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. And Isaiah was to go out to show the glory of God to the people and to get the people to recognize that they weren't going to listen. They weren't going to hear. And there was going to be a response because of that. Isaiah offering to go to reveal the glory of Yahweh to an unclean people. And here Abraham, brothers and sisters, is prepared to go forth and to show the character of God. That's what he's going to be doing in Genesis 22, isn't it? We're all familiar with the type that's going on here, with the offering of Isaac being a picture of God's own sacrifice of his son. And Abraham is prepared to go to show God. Back in Genesis 22 and in verse 2, God says, Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. And we've been talking, haven't we, brothers and sisters, about phrases that the Spirit doesn't need to use. Sarah, thy wife, thy son, Isaac, thine only son, whom thou lovest. 4 times, brothers and sisters, and at least 3 of them are redundant. Abraham didn't need to know which son. He only had one left. Ishmael had gone. Abraham didn't need to know that Isaac was the son whom he loved. Of course he was. But God is making the point, isn't he? This is your relationship with your son. And we're going to see it come up again and again in Genesis 22. This is your relationship with your son. This will be my relationship with my son, thine only son. Ishmael has been disowned at this point. Isaac is the only son left. Just come and have a look at Hebrews chapter 11, because the record in Hebrews picks up on this aspect, picks up on this point. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17. By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had gladly received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And so the Spirit in Hebrews makes the same point. The point that we didn't need to know. Point that didn't need to be made. But that the Spirit emphasizes. This was the only son of Abraham, whom Abraham is being told to give up, to sacrifice for God. And God commands him in verse 2, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Offer him for a burnt offering. The offering, brothers and sisters, of dedication, the offering of complete and wholehearted service, the offering which said of the offerer, I am giving myself to God. And this is what God is demanding of Abraham here, isn't it? This is what God is requiring of Abraham again, to show us that this is what God would give. That this was to be what God would give. Deuteronomy chapter 4. Just have a look at Deuteronomy 4 and verse 23. Deuteronomy 4 and verse 23. Take heed unto yourselves, lest ye forget the covenant of Yahweh your God, which he made with you, and make you a graven image or the likeness of anything which Yahweh thy God hath forbidden thee. For Yahweh thy God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. God, brothers and sisters, demands all of our service, doesn't he? And when we have tested, and when we have scrutinized what's in our lives, and when we have considered those things, whether they measure up to God or not, the step then has to be to remove them. Because if they don't, then that isn't a wholehearted service, is it? If they don't, then that isn't a burnt offering which we're offering to God. That is what God requires of us. He is a consuming fire. And just note, brothers and sisters, God says to Abraham to offer a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham's been in this position before, hasn't he? He was in Ur of the Chaldees, and God says and appears to him and says to him, get out from where you are, from your house and from your family and from your father's house, and go to a land that I will show thee. Abraham gets up and he goes and he makes his journey of faith into the land that he doesn't know and he's never been, and he has to have God to show him the way. And here it's the same thing. God is telling him, get up and go, and you're going to go to a place that I'm going to show you. You don't get to choose, Abraham, where this happens. I am going to show you. This was all under the careful guidance of God, wasn't it? Abraham had no choice over where he went or how he offered Isaac. Abraham couldn't say, well, I'd really rather not offer him as a burnt offering. Can offer him as something else instead. And I don't really want to go there because it's miles away. It's going to take me days. Can I stay here? God's instructions were precise, and Abraham was required to follow them. And it's just the same with his own son, isn't it? It was just the same with Christ, who consistently and constantly throughout his ministry kept having to tell the people, the hour is not yet come. God had set a time and God had set a place, and it was going to be then and it was going to be there. Christ couldn't make it come quicker or choose that the offering be in a different way. God had set these things in place. And so in verse 3 in Genesis 22, Abraham responds. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son and clave the wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Complete obedience, brothers and sisters, to the things which God had said. And did you notice that there were 7 things which Abraham did? He rose up early. He saddled his ass. He took 2 of his young men. He took Isaac his son. He clave the wood. He rose up and he went unto the place of which God had told him. And each one of them are connected by this word and Abraham, and Abraham, and Abraham. And it's taking us back again, brothers and sisters, to Genesis, isn't it? In Genesis chapter 1. Because that's the structure that we've got in the creation. If you come back to Genesis chapter 1 and have a look at the way in which that's set out. The creation from verse 3 of Genesis chapter 1, where we're told, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, and God divided, and God called. And verse 6, and God said. Verse 7, and God made. Verse 8, and God called. Verse 9, and God said, and it was so, and God called. It's the same structure throughout Genesis chapter 1. We have these little connecting words with an action from God after them. Over the 7 days of creation, and God, and God, and God. And we have the same structure here in Genesis 22 and verse 3. 7 things which Abraham rose up early to do. This was going to be, brothers and sisters, a task typical of the new creation. It was going to be the means, typically, by which the new creation would come to pass. And so in verse 4, on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And we can see the wonderful way, brothers and sisters, in which the details fit together with the details of the life of the Master. The ministry of Christ lasted, didn't it, for 3.5 years. And so it was 3 days' journey, plus the little bit extra once they'd left the young men, to walk to Isaac's death. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. That phrase also comes back in Genesis chapter 18. In Genesis 18 and verse 1, we're told that Yahweh appeared to Abraham in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And in verse 2, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. And that phrase, as it goes on through Genesis, seems always to do with salvation and the idea of looking up to salvation and the means by which salvation might come. And so this is what we have here. Abraham lifting up his eyes and looking up to see the way in which salvation was to come. And he saw the place afar off. Just come forward to Genesis chapter 37. In Genesis chapter 37, Joseph is searching for his brothers. And a man tells him in verse 17, they departed hence, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. And so Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. And it's a picture, isn't it? It's a type of the way the Lord Jesus Christ was searching to bring back his brethren. And verse 18 of Genesis 37 says, when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. They see him afar off. They plan to kill him, but ultimately we know he was spared, and through Joseph a way was provided for those brothers to gain salvation, for those brothers ultimately to be brought back in and shown the way of faith. And so again, brothers and sisters, we have this wonderful picture, don't we, of the Lord Jesus Christ. Abraham lifted up his eyes. He saw the place afar off. God was providing a means by which salvation would come for Abraham's family. And so in verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again. So he leaves the 2 who had come with the donkey, And he takes Isaac, and they go off alone together. And Abraham says, we will worship and come again. The word worship means to prostrate, to bow down, and therefore to worship. It's the word that's used again in Genesis chapter 18, verse 2. Abraham, having lifted up his eyes, having seen the three men, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. He recognizes their greatness and he bows himself before them. If you just come and have a look at Psalm 95. And verse 3, we're told, Yahweh is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the deep places of the earth. The strength of the hills is his also. The greatness of God is brought out. And in verse 6, the response is, O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before Yahweh, our Maker. And that's the attitude which Abraham has, isn't it? The attitude is one of submission to one who is superior. And Abraham classes what he is doing as worship. And brothers and sisters, we saw, didn't we, in Brother David's talks, worship is on God's terms. This isn't how Abraham would have chosen to worship, is it? This isn't what Abraham would have chosen to do. If God had just said to him, worship me, this is not the action that Abraham would have taken. But Abraham recognizes that his submission to the commands and the will of God were an act of worship from him. And that, brothers and sisters, should be our attitude as well, shouldn't it? The way in which our worship is ordered should be in accordance to the things which God has set down, and not the things which necessarily we find most comfortable to do. We will go yonder, we will worship, and come again. And that, in the Hebrew, the final verb, to come again, is also first person plural. We will go yonder, we will worship, we will come again. Abraham, brothers and sisters, confidently expects both himself and Isaac to return to the young men waiting with the ass. Abraham confidently believes that even if he kills his son, he is going to get him back again. And again, that's what we read in Hebrews 11, wasn't it? Abraham, in verse 19, accounted that God was able to raise up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Abraham knew, brothers and sisters, that God had promised. Abraham was confident in the promise of God. And so Abraham believed that he and his son would both be returning. And so in verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went, both of them together. That phrase, both of them together, it comes here at the end of verse 6. It comes again at the end of verse 8. They went, both of them together. There was a unity, brothers and sisters, of purpose and a unity of will between these two. And there's Isaac bearing the means of his sacrifice on his back, while Abraham takes hold of the things which would slay him, the fire and a knife. And the type, again, brothers and sisters, works perfectly, doesn't it? We have Christ who carried his cross, who bore the sins of the people. And we have God who arranged the situation and brought it about that Christ would die in that way. And in verse 7 of Genesis chapter 22, Isaac speaks for the very first time. And he says one word. Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And we've seen the same phrase back in verse 1. Here am I. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? The word lamb there, it's not the usual word that's used for lamb. It's a word that's a different word, used about 60 times more. This is a word which means one of a flock, or one of sheep. So instead of speaking necessarily about an individual lamb, it's a word which means just one out of a multitude of them. And it's the word that's used predominantly in Exodus chapter 12 for the Passover lamb. But it's also used in a particular way in the law. Come and have a look at Leviticus in chapter 5. Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 6, or in verse 5 we're told, It shall be when he shall be guilty in one of these things, he shall confess that he hath sinned in that thing, and he shall bring his trespass, his guilt offering unto Yahweh, for his sin which he hath sinned, a female from the flock, a lamb or a kid of the goats for a sin offering, and the priest shall make an atonement for him concerning his sin. That's the different word for lamb. But in verse 7 we're told, If he be not able to bring a lamb, then he shall bring for his trespass which he hath committed 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons unto Yahweh. And that word in verse 7 is the same word as Isaac uses for lamb. If you can't bring a lamb, then there was something else that was provided. And if you just come forward a few pages to Leviticus chapter 12 and have a look at verse 8, verse 6, we're told, When the days of her purifying are fulfilled for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring a lamb of the first year for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation unto the priest. That's the different word for lamb. But in verse 8 we're told, If she be not able to bring a lamb, then she shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for the burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And that's the same word for lamb as Isaac uses in Genesis 22. So in Leviticus 5 and in Leviticus 12, there was an alternative. If you couldn't bring a lamb, then you could bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons in Leviticus chapter 12. Where's the lamb? If you couldn't bring a lamb, God made provision for you. Where's the lamb? Just look at Leviticus in chapter 22. Leviticus chapter 22 and verse 20, we're told, Whatsoever hath a blemish, that shall ye not offer, for it shall not be acceptable for you. And whosoever offereth a sacrifice of peace offerings unto Yahweh, to accomplish his vow, or a free will offering in his herd or his flock, it shall be perfect to be accepted. There shall be no blemish therein. Blind or broken or maimed or having a wen or scurvy or scabbed, ye shall not offer these unto Yahweh, nor make an offering by fire of them upon the altar unto Yahweh. Either a bullock or a lamb, it's the same word as Genesis 22, that hath anything superfluous or lacking in his parts, that mayest thou offer for a free will offering, but for a vow it shall not be accepted. So, brothers and sisters, if you couldn't bring a lamb, then something else was provided. But if you had a lamb that was either superfluous or lacking in some way, you couldn't offer it for a vow, but you could offer it for your free will offering. And what a wonderful picture, brothers and sisters, of the Lord Jesus Christ. We couldn't, brothers and sisters, bring a lamb, but God provided a lamb. And he provided a lamb who was prepared to come as a free will offering. Who was prepared to offer himself. And it's interesting also, it's the same word that's used when you're offering a drink offering. And if you offer a drink offering, you offered it on top of or as well as another sacrifice. And in that circumstance, it's this word lamb that's used. And the drink offering, brothers and sisters, was the subservient offering. So if you come and have a look at Philippians and chapter 2, Philippians 2 and verse 17. Yea, and if I be offered, you'll notice your margin has poured forth. The Greek means to be poured out as a drink offering, as a libation. If I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy and rejoice with you all. So they had made the sacrifice, and the Apostle Paul says, and I'm just the drink offering, being offered on top, being offered as well. Paul recognizes the greatness of others' sacrifices comparative to his own. And again, brothers and sisters, it fits perfectly with Genesis 22, doesn't it? Because all we've got in Genesis 22 is pointing forward to the greater sacrifice. When God would give his Son that we might be saved. Isaac, brothers and sisters, is a shadow, is a type of the true offering. Where's the lamb for a burnt offering? Says Isaac. And Abraham says, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went, both of them together. And brothers and sisters, if we ever wondered whether Isaac knew what was going on, whether Isaac understood what was happening, this phrase, they went, both of them together, shows that he did. Isaac understood. He knew that he was the one who was going to be provided. He was the one whom God had given. He was the one given to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. And so in verse 9, they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And just note, brothers and sisters, again, the positions of these two. There is Abraham who takes the action. He builds the altar. He lays the wood. And there's Isaac just standing there. Can't imagine altar building is a quick task. Can't imagine it took, Abraham 5 minutes just to knock up a quick altar and sort the wood out. But it's pictured as though Abraham is there doing the work, while Isaac's just standing there, just waiting for the time to come. The willing sacrifice as his father makes the preparations and puts the things in order and sets everything up and then places his son on the altar. He binds him. He lays him on the altar upon the wood. And in verse 10, he stretched forth his hand. Let's come back to Genesis chapter 3 and have a look at verse 22. Genesis 3 and verse 22, we're told that Yahweh Elohim said, "Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." Therefore Yahweh Elohim sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. Adam, brothers and sisters, could have stretched out his hand and taken and eaten and lived forever, and that was not the way everlasting life was to come. Abraham stretched out his hand to kill his son, and that was the way that everlasting life was to come. Abraham is stretching out his hand in the only way possible for men to live forever. Adam was prevented, Abraham was commanded. And it shows, doesn't it, the two ways which are open to us. Do we grasp at eternal life? Or are we prepared to sacrifice to obtain it? There are two roads, brothers and sisters, that we can walk down. And only one of them will lead us to life. He took the knife, it says, to slay his son. New English translation has, he prepared in order to slaughter his son. There was no hesitation. There was a methodical setting about the task which God had given him. And it shows, doesn't it, the great determination of purpose which he had and the great faith which Isaac had. Do we really think, brothers and sisters, that in a foot race between Isaac, who was probably somewhere between 25 and 35, almost certainly around 33, and Abraham, his 120, 130-year-old father, that in a foot race between the two of them, is there any way that Isaac loses? Is there any way that Isaac, as he recognizes that this is what's going to happen, doesn't win in a race down that hill? But he stays as a type of the Lord, as a type of our Master, who continuously had opportunity to say no to the sacrifice that was coming, who kept being faced with times when, well, why don't you make yourself king? And waited. Because he trusted in his Father. Because he believed that when his Father commanded, then he was to be obedient to that command, and gave himself to death, even the death of the cross. And Isaac, brothers and sisters, gave himself to death, even the death of a sacrifice, at the hand of his Father, because he trusted, because he believed that when his Father said, God will keep his promise, that God would keep his promise. What a testament it is, brothers and sisters, to these two as they go together to make this offering. What a testament it is to Abraham, who has brought up his son to have his faith. What an example it is for us, fathers. What if we told our children that this is what we were going to do to them? But don't worry, because God will keep his promises. What in our lives would they be able to look at and say, well, Dad obviously believes that. That's obviously ordered the way in which he lives. That is the example which he's set me. So I trust him. When he says that God will keep his promises, that God will keep his promises. So I'm happy to go along, to follow him, even if it means my own death. And so in verse 11, the angel of Yahweh called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. God proved Abraham. He tested him, just as he would test Israel in the wilderness. Abraham, brothers and sisters, passed that test. Isaac, along with him, showed his faith in the promises. And so Abraham then receives the blessing at the end of Genesis chapter 22. The blessing of one who was certain and sure to receive those promises. God says in verse 16, By myself have I sworn, saith Yahweh, for because thou hast done this thing and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, in blessing I will bless thee, in multiplying I will multiply thee. Because Abraham had done this thing, brothers and sisters, he received the unconditional promise for him and his seed. And tomorrow, God willing, we're going to see the chapter in which Isaac receives the same thing, the same unconditional promise in recognition of his faith and service and fear of God.